Welcome to the last lecture for Unit 6. In this lecture we're talking about, once again, one of our art impulses, one of the main themes about what people say with art, but also one of the main themes as to why people make art. And in this case we're talking about the relationship between art and power. By the way, I was, just as I was closing out the other lecture, I remembered that the magazine that Annie Leibovitz did a lot of the late work for is Vanity Fair. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to be looking at a lot of artwork. A lot of the artwork is going to be work we've seen before, but now we're going to be looking at it primarily just from the point of view of what it says about the relationship between art and power. And we're going to talk both about artwork that's seemingly very much about the supporting of power, and that's a main reason for art to function, is to support the powers that be. But we're also going to look at art that tries to tries to criticize power, tries to speak truth to power, so to speak. And we're going to talk about how possible is that really. So let's start with the Dying Lioness. So when we look at the Dying Lioness, and we've seen it multiple times, we probably see it from one point of view, which is it appears to be an image of artwork of sympathy, right? That it's hard for us to imagine that someone would have sculpted this, right? And also keep in mind, you have to imagine the Dying Lioness in its full context, because here is the lioness, but the lioness is part of a larger hunting scene. And the lioness has been pierced by these arrows, right? She's paralyzed in the lower body, and she's dragging herself towards the male lion, probably her mate, who is also seemingly close to dying. So it's a very sad, pitiful scene of this lioness, calling out in pain and dragging herself as she's paralyzed. And like I said, it's very hard for us to imagine anyone having carved this and not doing it out of a certain amount of sympathy for the lioness, right? That seems to be the point of the work. But there's not really any good historical evidence that that's what the sculptor was trying to do. The purpose of the scene that he was working on was not to express any sympathy for lions whatsoever. It was about glorifying the power of the king, the emperor of Assyria, proving that he is truly the most powerful in all the world, right? Just like the scenes of him fighting in battles were not about having sympathy for his victims. They were about proving how fierce, how dominant, how unopposable the king is. And yet it is, it's hard for us not to believe that the person who's carving this, the craftsman, if they were, a free person or if they were a slave, that they didn't have a certain amount of attachment and sympathy for this lioness as she was dying, a sense of seeing in her position something similar to our condition. But we have to accept the possibility that we are just reading that in, that is not there at all, or at least not there from the original artist, and that is purely just a meaning that we create from our modern context. Because, like I said, most art for most of the history of humankind was unambiguously supportive of the political powers of its time. So if we look at another part of these reliefs from Ashurbanipal, we see that this sculptor, who might not be the same sculptor as the other one, there's nothing in here where he's thinking, I gotta show the sympathy for the lion. It's all about showing the scary, glorious power of the king. And the same with artwork from around the world. Most of the art made from most of the history of humankind was strongly in support for the political powers of its day, and especially the military powers of its day. But we keep finding these kind of odd exceptions. Here's a set of pieces, right, designed for and by the city of Gaul, called the Dying, or not the city of Gaul, city of Pergamon, called often. Well, today we call it the Dying Gauls. As to what they called it, we're not entirely sure. but these are a set of sculptures that were made by the city to celebrate their victory over these figures here, these Gauls, right? And what's interesting, though, is in these sculptures, there's no heroic sculptures of the Pergamon army doing the defeating, right? The sculptures are just of the victims or of the the defeated, and they are housed. They were housed near the temple of Zeus. I think maybe we all remember the temple of Zeus that we've seen a couple of times in class. So at an essential part of the city, and so it's kind of interesting and strange that that as a war memorial, they focus on showing their defeated enemies rather than showing themselves as heroically defeating the enemies, and that they're also showing the defeated enemies in kind of heroic poses, right? Like here, they seem to be kind of heroic and somewhat sympathetic. They're in this case, he's just about to kill himself, right? Because he will die on his sword rather than be captured, and his wife has just already done that. She's already killed himself. So, one theory is that the Romans felt like they had to make their enemies appear as heroic and as idealistic or idealized as possible in order to make their victory over the Gauls as impressive as possible. But it is, once again, it's hard to not shake the feeling that maybe there was a certain amount of sympathy for the other side. We also see artists in the Hellenistic period, just like the Dying Gauls, we start to see artists becoming interested in people other than the elite. This is a good example of this old beggar woman, where we see an artist looking at someone who normally, back in the Hellenic period of Greek art, no one would have ever even thought of making a sculpture about an old beggar woman. But here we have this sculpture. And then as a kind of a related comparison, I have this print, lithograph by Daumier, that's also about how the other half live, right? This is a crime scene at an apartment, and every member of the family was killed. It's dark. This might be a good place for me to stop this lecture because we have more to go.